Good evening and welcome to the May edition of the Maine Public Book Club. I'm your host, Bill Nemitz, and this evening we are joined by Gillian Burnes, author of our May book, Soft Features. Now, for anybody familiar with recent Maine history, this was a fun read. And for anyone who's dabbled in journalism, myself included, Soft Features captures that sometimes blurry line between work and home, between what's private and what's out there for all to see. In short, we've got a lot to talk about tonight. But before we do and get to Gillian, I, as always, want to thank Bull Moose and Coffee by Design for their generous support of the club. Without organizations like these, events like this would not be possible. I'd also like to recognize our bookstore partners, in addition to Bull Moose, where many of you secured your copy of Soft Features. Thanks to Bookstacks in Bucksport, None Such Books and More in South Portland, Mockingbird Bookshop in Bath, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, DDG Booksellers in Farmington, Left Bank Books in Belfast, and Print in Portland. Also, at each book club event, we randomly select book club members for generous prizes. Congratulations this month to Ray and Sue, Edward and Bonnie, Mary, Eileen, and Polly for winning subscriptions to AudioFile magazine. And congrats to Molly for winning a subscription to Decor magazine. If you have a question during our conversation tonight, send it over to us at fun@mainepublic.org, and I'll try to work it into the discussion. So let's get started. Gillian, welcome.
Thank you so much. It is an absolute thrill to be here. I'm really honored.
Well, we're glad to have you. And as I said before, this book gives us plenty to chew on, I have to say. But first, I like to begin. Also, congratulations, by the way. This is your first novel. Is that correct?
It is. Yes, it is.
That's a big accomplishment. So let's just start with the genesis of that, the first novel, in terms of, how it came to be, how you came to be here in Maine, and with really such a narrative command of how this state works. Was this a wake up in the middle of the night moment, I have a book in me, or was it something that took longer than that?
It started out as a little bit of a dare from a friend. I published a short story that was written in little blocks, little epiphanies. And this friend said, is there a book in here somewhere? Can there be a novel from one of these characters? And I thought about it, and Billy Ahern was the one who seemed to want to do more. And then I thought about where I would want to spend hundreds of hours imaginatively. And so Soft Features is very much an exercise in wish fulfillment. I worked for a year as an intern in public radio, not in Maine, in North Carolina, and I absolutely loved it. But unfortunately, it turned out I had a voice for print, and I only spent that 1 year. But I never forgot, and I love the technology of it. I love the whole medium. I love the form of storytelling. So I thought if I could have Billy and public radio, and then I was casting about for a central problem. And my mother passed away suddenly in 2002. And I wound up with a problem like Coralie's. I had no shell and was really not well for a long time. I was empathizing much too much with every news story, every sad anecdote. And it took me, some therapy and meditation and time. But that problem never really seemed to become passé. I keep waiting for this book to be to feel dated, but that problem of caring too much and caring in a slightly unwise way seemed to be a vein I could tap into.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the first questions I had, of course, whenever we talk about that challenge that Coralie faces, it's of course the famous dead air incident. When she's doing last minute in there doing the news, and all of a sudden has what I guess the world wants to agree euphemistically was a fainting spell. But we know it was much more than that. And I remember as I was reading that, and then other times in the book where she kind of goes down those wormholes, fixated on a story or a group of stories. I thought to myself, is it possible to write that kind of thing? Because it was so riveting and realistic without having experienced it. And I guess you've answered that question. You felt her pain, in other words.
I did. And the challenge, one of the challenges was figuring out different ways for that pain to express itself. In an early draft, which I gave to a friend to read, she was mostly crying. She was mostly breaking down in tears. And my friend said, "Oh, I wanted to gag. I can't stand all this crying," which might say a little bit about him, but he was still right. And then another friend said, "Well, maybe it could be kind of like an alcoholic. Alcoholics sometimes find themselves doing all kinds of things to cope. So they might lie to friends, they hide things, they pretend that they're sick when they're not. All kinds of inappropriate coping mechanisms get them through the week." And that really helped. And that's how she came to have a laughing fit at a circumcision demonstration. And she has that one passing out part, and she lies to her colleagues and she dodges work. That created many more opportunities for Coralie to cause and get through lots of disasters.
I laughed out loud at the circumcision scene. It reminded me of that. I don't know if you remember this, the famous Mary Tyler Moore show where she's at the funeral for Bubbles the clown and she can't stop laughing while they're
Yes.
that same kind of thing, which is totally inappropriate, but hilariously funny at the same time. Let's talk about, Coralie, as I started this book, and you've confirmed a little bit of this to me, that there are some very strong connections between you, the author, and Coralie, your narrator, main character. But then along comes Helen. And all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute. The author isn't all Coralie. If you really want to draw a direct line from Gillian Burnes to one of these characters, it seems more like Helen. Tell us about some of, you've already touched on it, but tell us about some of the parallels that you had with Helen.
Helen is an intern. She's also a slightly older intern than usual. I already had a master's degree turning up, but I was starting fresh. And I was just as eager and just as earnest. Not as smart as Helen. Helen has a natural knack for a lot of things. But I knew about the pitch knob, the little device on the mixing board that can lower the tone of your voice and make you sound like a public radio voice. But I had been told not to play with that was not available to me. And everything had to be myself. And I had wonderful mentors at my station who tried to coach me, who put me through. I even went to a voice coach for a couple of sessions, and she had me lie on the floor and whisper to the ceiling and then press my back against the far wall and sing to her from far away. Oh. And nothing really worked. So Helen is the intern that I wished I could have been. And in the end, I think we see that she probably has a future in this field.
Well, I was going to ask you later. I'll ask you now. Where is Helen today in your world, in your mind? This is now what, roughly 30 years later. Where is she? Is she on All Things Considered every night? Is she right there with Mary Louise, or what happened to her?
She might have her own show. She might be doing something, doing the public radio show of record on the environment.
That sounds about right. Speaking of names and speaking of NPR people, I've always been a real stickler. I've gotten a real kick out of a lot of NPR reporters have the coolest names, like
why is that?
Sylvia Porgioli, and then who you even mention in the book. In fact, where did you come up with? Is it Threlfell? Is that how? I guess you decide how to pronounce it since she's your character, but Coralie Threlfell sounds like an NPR name. Did that just come to you?
I had the name Coralie in my head for a long time, and I don't remember where it came from. Threlfell, I noticed in the crawling credits of some movie I was watching, and I fell in love with the name as soon as I saw it.
Ah,
Um,
okay. Well, it
yeah.
fit perfectly, I thought. Uh, this story is largely about radio. It's about a lot of other things, but it keeps coming back to radio. And radio, of course, is about sound, small sounds that many of us hear every day without hearing them at all, and large sounds like the Mayday call coming from a burning boat off the coast of Maine. But it becomes a pattern throughout the story that going into it, virtually every situation, Coralie begins by, as she puts it, laying down the background sound of how a story is going to work. I'm thinking when you visit the guy, the woman who's saving the animals, for example, and walking through the farmyard area, just taping everything in sight. And it made me wonder, what did your time in radio, which is a medium in which the audience sees nothing. What did that teach you about the average person's awareness or relationship with everyday sound?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. We must be sensitive to sound, or else the art of radio wouldn't be so complex. There is the need to just lay down room tones, so because the ear can pick up the little edits. At the same time, I'm sometimes surprised when people can sit in a coffee shop next to the big refrigerators droning and not be made crazy by that. But
Yeah.
I think it matters. I think it matters a lot. I think people are also able to adapt. I'm, in my early to mid 50s, and to me, listening to music on teeny little earbuds is intolerable. But my teenage daughter finds it normal and fine.
Mhm.
So I think it might even be, I don't know, it might even be cultural, what
Yeah.
sounds
Yeah.
we notice and what sounds we don't.
And the other thing that struck me was at one point, kind of as an explainer as to why she's doing this, and however innocuous the background sound might be, the alternative, which is total silence in the background, felt jarring. That you lose that sense of place if you don't have that underlying rabble, whatever it might be. And so I started thinking about that and thinking you very rarely hear people interviewed on radio or TV for that matter, and sound like they're in a sound booth. It's always much more environmental than that. And it's a challenge. I was a print journalist for 45 years, so I didn't have to worry about this stuff. I worried about words that would describe things, but radio has always been very unique that way, in that you really need to capture it because it's all you've got, right?
And you can't have extraneous sounds interfering with your source's comments, because then you can't edit them, even if you wanted to. There's a part where Coralie is trying to interview somebody on a boat, and she's figuring out where she can stand so that the wind is blocked by the wheelhouse. All these little extra,
Little tricks.
and those little things add tension, I think, just to her day. Everything is a little harder.
Yeah. Yeah, I just see this one, and I've seen it myself with Maine public reporters, with all this stuff, and it makes the job a lot more challenging. The other thing that I really want to get into, because you really show a great command for this, and that, as I mentioned at the introduction, is Maine history and recent Maine history. And none more, well, there were two, but we'll start with the first one, which is Father, is it Bissell? Or I assume that's how
Father Burris.
Burris, I'm sorry.
Burris, that's okay.
Written down here. And his crew from Loaves and Fishes, which bears a very strong resemblance to the Maine Seacoast Mission and their boat, which I believe is called Sunbeam, I believe. And
So.
they do much the same thing, flying up and down the coast, helping folks. And I wondered, did you spend time with those folks? How did you get such a strong familiarity with how this ship operated?
Oh, well, I'm flattered by that question. I saw the ship when I was visiting friends on Idaho. It was docked doing some work. And I asked them, what is that? And they told me just the basics. And I loved the idea of it. And that was maybe 15 years ago. And just filed it away as something I wanted to play with someday at some point. And I think I remember doing enough research just to know roughly how big it is. I wanted to know what kind of, just physically what kind of boat it was. And then I didn't want to know anymore.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to be able to fill it in myself. Then when I was finished, I did a little more research to make sure it wasn't too similar to the real thing.
Yeah.
And changed a couple of little details.
So you never, oh, that's real. Well, my compliments even more stronger then, because I really thought she must have been on that boat for at least a week.
Oh, thank
Just
you.
something familiar. And the other one, of course, is what the gentleman we all know as the North Pond Hermit. And I believe that would have your time in Maine. You came to Maine 2002, so that would have included the time of that story developed over time. Where did you come up with the Ptarmigan Pond Goblin?
Ptarmigan Pond, an imaginary place.
Yeah.
Again, I actually cut the stories about the North Pond Hermit out of the KJ and kept them in a file because I was so taken with the poignancy of that story, how somebody could live that way and why somebody would choose to live that way. But then I didn't reread them. I just remembered the premise, and I didn't read was it Stranger in the Woods, the Michael Finkel book.
Right.
I just wanted to imagine it myself. And then when I was finished, then I read his GQ article. And again, I changed some details that I had guessed too correctly. I think it was how he dealt with his garbage. The Christopher Knight buried his garbage, so I had my hermit take his stuff to a dumpster and leave it that way. But yeah, throughout, I just wanted to have a little bit of take advantage of some of the real fascinating life that's all around us. But not impinge too much on it. I don't want, I never want to say that any of this it's hardly based on reality.
Right. Well, but it paralleled it very well. And, anybody who lived through that story knew that, well, it actually had a fairly happy ending. I thought, as you were introducing this, teasing it kind of early in the book, that you were going to go find this guy. And instead, or Coralie, I'm saying you, but Coralie, but instead, in effect, he finds Coralie, where she sends him the tapes, and he kind of anoints her the keeper of his story. Why that approach? Were you tempted to send Coralie? Well, you did send her out into the woods at one point, where she went oh so far, and then stopped and came back. But why not keep going? Why did you decide at that point that her search for him would end there?
Throughout composing this book, I tended to give myself, I guess I think of them as, streetlights in a big scary parking lot. I want her to get from this streetlight to that streetlight over there, but I want her to get there in a surprising way. And so I knew that the hermit story had to be resolved. And I wanted him to give her some kind of message that would, if not solve, then change her problem. And I thought that if they meet through radio, she sends him tapes and convinces him that she will be gentle. And she gives him earplugs because she knows that the prison must be horribly loud to him. That would be a more interesting way to get them into communication. And they don't really even speak. He gives her a potato chip bag full of full of his
right.
journals.
Not
But
much
then
of
she
an
gets to
interview.
use them. Then, yeah, then she
Right.
gets to use them to make a story so that we, the readers can enjoy it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Ptarmigan Pond, why that name? I mean, I know it's a bird, and I know it's a bird that lives in considerable solitude. Am I on the right track here?
yeah, the very northern, they change colors. Um, it was a fun project coming up with place names. You know,
Yeah.
Maine place names seem to me to have, there are towns named after virtues like, you know, friendship and liberty and unity.
Yeah.
And then there are, so I have probity in here. There are classical locations, Rome. So he's in Thrace. There
Mhm.
are, you know, European place names. And then there are names, native names and names for animals. So there's Moosehead Lake and lots of northern animal place names. And ptarmigan had not been taken yet. That was an animal
Yeah.
that was available to me.
What about Rentham? Where did Rentham come from? Because that's a suburb of, well, not a suburb of Boston, but it's in, southeastern Massachusetts. Did that just pop up for you?
I went
Or
to
in
high
all of
school
southern Maine,
in,
Massachusetts?
yeah, Wrentham, Debenham, Aldborough, Beccles. I went to high school in England. My dad was in the Air Force and we were
Oh,
stationed at an Air Force base there. Those are all names of places that I loved when I was growing up. And unfortunately, they didn't all turn out to be great places in the novel. I hope my friends who are there, if they ever find out about it, aren't hurt.
yeah. We have a bunch of questions from audience members. I've been hogging the discussion here, so I'm going to go to a couple of those. One audience member wrote, "I'm not sure reading this if you liked the life of a reporter. Did you? Would you return to such work? Do you feel as a reporter that you had to make too many compromises?"
It was hard. It was hard. And I often felt that I had to dare myself to go to people in distress and ask them the hard questions. Even when I was working at the magazine after my internship at radio as a fact checker, I'll never forget a fellow fact checker in the desk next to me had to fact check a report on a husband and wife pair of backpackers who had been attacked by bandits in Pakistan, and the husband was killed. And I heard my friend Jake on the phone saying, "And was he shot once in the leg and twice in the chest?" "Oh,
Hmm.
twice in the chest and once in the leg." "Okay. And how many hours was he still breathing?" Having to check every fact. And
Yeah,
he was just, we were all shaken.
yeah.
It is a hard thing. As you know, journalists have to wade into uh, the worst of what's happening. So did I enjoy it? I definitely felt it was noble, and I admire journalists of all kind. I like to think I would be able to pull it off at least for a while, but I don't know, maybe I would have had Corley's problem through that work.
Yeah. Well,
That answers the question.
it's I know what you mean. I used to read my columns to my wife before I filed them, and sometimes it'd be a really, a real heart-wrenching human interest story, and I'd get three-quarters of the way through them, and all of a sudden I'm in tears, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what's happening here? So it's easy to get drawn into it. Like, I think the key, and talk to me about this, but Coralie had to find a way toward, which maybe she never did, was where do how to close that door when you move on, and not to how she seemed to carry everything with her.
She did. And there's the consolation of bearing witness, the consolation of knowing that telling the story might make things better in the future. When she meets Kyle Parshall in the end, the hermit, she realizes a little bit more the value of just the contact that comes from reporting on somebody.
Mhm.
And I guess in a way, this is a love letter to local journalism. And because it's set in the mid-90s, I didn't have to deal with a lot of the hand-wringing and worry about journalism
Right.
as an industry.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was another thing I wanted to talk about. And that is that when you write about the mid 90s, in fact, I think more than once, this is when you're trying to find the woman Kay Gerritsen, whose name you don't yet know, who has demonstrating, I asked you this earlier, I can't remember the condition.
Oh, hypernamonic syndrome. She can't
Hypernamonic
forget.
syndrome. She can't forget things. In fact, and in her case, she can't forget experiential things, if I recall. So why I kept trying to juxtapose her with Coralie, because Coralie's having trouble forgetting too, but on a much different level. What was Kay Gerritsen's job in this book? Why did you bring her into it?
Coralie is trying to give herself a series of therapeutic assignments. She's using her job to try to figure out the answer to her problem. And when she happens to hear the story about Kay, the woman with a perfect memory, she thinks, oh, she will be able to tell me the answer. She must remember every bad thing that ever happens. So how does she get through the day? I must find her, and she'll tell me. Kay is one of the gurus that Coralie seizes on. And then
it blows up in her face.
Blows up a little bit.
I thought it was a class reunion interview. But that gets me back to what I was going to ask before, and that is, you mentioned how this was in the early to mid 90s. And in looking for Kay, I saw at least one reference, maybe more than one, I think it was to Nexus Lexis searches and all those old-fashioned ways that we used to use to try to obtain far-flung information. If you had tried to write this story today in the current time with social media, I've asked this question of other authors who write about that period too. Social media, in the case of, if you're in the media, the just unbelievably different technology compared to 10, 20 years ago. Would that have been harder? Did you deliberately set it in that time? Or how do you feel about transposing a story like this into modern day technology?
It would be a different story. I set it in 95 because that's when I was in radio. And I thought, I'm just going to use the technology I know, Marantz's, DATs, the Akai. That way I don't have to learn all the new stuff. And I knew I wanted my characters to be able to be alone without having to concoct, dead cell phone batteries or no coverage. And also it was a real golden age. That was when This American Life was coming on. There was a lot of exciting stuff in public radio. But once I got into it, I realized that it made some of the searches longer and more complex. I suspect it would be the work of 10 minutes to find Kay now.
Right, exactly. Yeah. A quick Google search and you're there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so other challenges would come to fill the vacuum. And Kay would see her coming,
Sure. That's right. Yeah, I love the reference to This American Life, because that actually touch on that in the book with somebody misidentifies him as, I think, Philip Glass instead of Ira Glass, and I'm thinking, wow, you feel like he's been around forever, but I guess not. That was the time when that longer form of radio journalism was just emerging. You look at it now, I mean, it's everywhere.
It's an institution. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got another reader comment here. This one is from Pam Stock in the town of Paris. She says, this is not so much a question, but a thank you to Gillian. I was a teacher on Matinicus Island for 2 years, 2013 to 15. I spent many evenings in the Sunbeam, the main, the real life mission, and became friends with a number of the crew members. Your book brought back memories I had forgotten. The wonderful ship and the good folks on it did a tremendous amount of good for so many. I imagine it still does. I enjoyed your book very much and look forward to tonight's event. So there you go. There's another.
Oh my gosh. Pam, thank you.
Speaking of the crew on the book, you may have given this away already with Billy. I loved all those people. I mean, they're all, I mean, if you're going to be on that boat, obviously you're going to be a good person. But who's your favorite? Who's your favorite crew member?
Ooh, Father Burris is somebody I would like to spend an afternoon with. He's
Mhm.
deep.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's been around.
And Coralie is hoping that she can spend an hour or two with him too. But if I recall, that never really happens. I keep
No,
waiting, just leaning over the rail, therapeutic kind of counseling session between him and her. And why not? Was it because she had to figure this out on her own, or?
I think she had to figure it out on her own.
Yeah.
And uh, it would have been nice for her. I suspect that if she had to figure it out on her own. I think she got something from seeing him and Patrick,
Mhm.
body and soul, all of all this goodness that was kind of gritty,
Yeah,
also, gritty goodness that
right.
could, she can believe exists.
You never know when someone's
But
going to
yeah,
sink a boat.
just think, yeah, either the boat sinks or he gets stoned or, it's time to leave. It's always
Right,
something.
right. Well, as an offshoot of that, do you spend time on the Maine coast? Did you, I don't know, did you walk around, Stonington and talk to the lobstermen? How did you get such a good sense as to how that culture, and by that I mean it's an economy, it's a justice system, it's all these things unto itself with very little outside interference. How did you tap into that to write so authoritatively about it?
I stole from my friends a lot. I have a good friend who lives on Friendship, Long Island, and I visit him often, and he's plugged into that world. A friend of mine who's a magazine journalist wrote about Matinicus and stayed at my house, and so he debriefed me on all of his adventures. I have friends who have friends in that world. Um, and again, I tried not to read real magazine stories. I wanted to be able to imagine as much as I could, given just a few data points.
Well, I
Um,
the the role that Billy played is, you know, judge, jury, lawyer, you name it, in settling something that could well, if it happened in real life, could well have made its way into every newspaper in Maine because somebody was going to get killed before this was over. Uh, that I think that's reflective of how this segment of the population prefers at times to handle things on their own.
that was one of the most fun scenes to write. The scene where he confronts the Tilbrooks and puts his hand inside the door
Yeah,
frame. And
knowing he won't shut the
that
door. Yeah.
I know that feeling of, I might even be doing it now, of acting a little bit out of my body, taking the dare, making the leap, and then I'll remember what I've done after the fact.
Yeah.
And Billy was doing that in that scene.
Yeah, we all
Um,
tend to do our best work at times like that, don't we? When you're out there on the edge. Uh, Another audience member wants to know, have you heard from other reporters, radio or print, on their reaction to the trials and tribulations of your primary character? Do you think you got the experience right? Uh, in
mm.
quotation marks.
I've gotten comments from people who are not reporters, but I've heard from nurses and therapists, people who likewise dip into other people's lives in hard moments, and they have said, reassuring things about the book that rang true for them, and
Hmm.
that was very gratifying.
Yeah, I'm sure. There's another great question here. It reminds me of a kid. I went and spoke to a kids class once years and years ago, and they all write you thank you notes when you're done. And this one kid said, "Dear Mr. Nemitz, thank you for so much for coming to our class and talking about the newspaper. I hope to be a reporter someday, and then maybe I'll be a writer."
Oh,
But this person asked the same question. This audience member says, is there a divide? Is there a big divide between being a reporter, meaning, let's say, your old public radio job, and a writer, meaning a first novelist? What do you think?
oh, I love that question because I think those two fields of endeavor work really well together. I think learning journalism teaches you specificity and awareness of what a reader wants to know and can take in. And then the fiction writing side teaches you about, style and doing it, telling a story in a way only you can tell it. And I'm very grateful that I bumbled into journalism when I did, because I call on those skills all the time when I'm writing fiction.
Makes it
So
believable.
I hope so. I hope so. And if I ever get back into nonfiction writing, I'm sure I will think about fiction writing techniques, about the management of time, how to make time pass fast or slowly, how much to say about a character to draw him or her in enough brushstrokes so that that person lives in the reader's imagination. They're very complementary.
Sure. Well, speaking of writing, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of your writing. Are you a schedule writer? I'm gonna write from 9 a.m. to noon on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays? Or how did how do you go about, how did you go about putting together this work? Was it structured, not structured? How'd you do it?
It started out very unstructured. I procrastinated for about a year. If I include all of the false starts. At the beginning, the entire novel was about Kay. Kay was the main character. I was trying to write a whole novel about a woman with a perfect memory. And if you think about it, I found it impossible, because whenever you write a paragraph of fiction, you're always selecting details. It's always a process of selection. So if you have a character who never selects, how do you do it? And then, so she was going to be a reporter with a perfect memory. And then it wound up as a book with multiple points of view. I had a chapter from Corley's point of view, one from Art Susie's point of view, Danny and Helen. And I even had it structured. I used a poems rhyme scheme, A, B, A, C, B, C, B, D. It was like the rhyme scheme of a poem, and those were the letter coded chapters.
The sequence.
The sequence. But then I couldn't come up with an overarching plot that I liked, that I hadn't seen in 15 movies before. And then sat with it. And eventually I realized that the story I cared most about was Corley and the Hermit. And then everything, once I figured that out, then the subplots became her stories, her assignments, and the arc presented itself. And at that point, then I started to write 1,000 words a day.
Oh, okay.
Starting in mid-morning, 1,000 words a day. And by that time, I probably physically wrote the book in 6 months, a first draft. But I'm counting that year of false starts as part of the composition process.
Excuse me, I dropped my notes here. So there was a discipline to it, where you were,
yes.
You're not going to get the work done if you don't come up with some kind of a system. But that's always it just seems very daunting to those of us who spend our lives banging out something, then you're done and you go on to the next thing. Keep coming back to something like this. It does require a lot of that kind of discipline. Speaking of Kate Gerritsen, how did you come up with her name? Because there's no connection to Tess, I take it.
No, in fact, I almost changed her name when I first heard of Tess Gerritsen.
Okay.
And then decided there are probably lots of Gerritsens out there. I knew I wanted her first name to be the same, to sound like an initial, because I liked that trick.
That was great. Yeah. How'd you know her name?
And then
yeah, that was a good moment. I thought, this is like an old Columbo episode, Right. But anyway, I just saw that name and it jumped out at me. I thought, I didn't know if you had a connection with Tess or if that was just something that happened. Let's talk about Lonnie. for a couple of minutes, because he's also a very significant character in this book. He leads two lives, really. He's on the one hand a farmer, a father, great father, I mean, puts the rest of us husbands to shame in terms of his accommodation and his understanding and all these things. But at the same time, he's churning out these novels, kind of sci-fi teen novels that maybe somebody, maybe nobody will ever read. Was this drawn from real life, or is this somebody you just made up? Or tell us about Lonnie.
I'm Lonnie too. You know, all of his stories are stories from my own list of short story ideas, stories I've started and put down. And I've, you know, have been writing for a very long time before I published anything. And so I liked that, the complement between his introversion and her extroversion. I know a lot of couples who have that symbiosis, and so his farming life would leave him mental time to create stories as he's working.
You got to think of something when you're out there working with the cows and whatnot. And speaking of which, I understand you have a family connection to a beef farm, correct?
Beef farm, yeah. My husband's family is Oakland's farm, which is beef, and I have friends who are dairy farmers. So I learned what I know about farming from hanging out with them.
Ah,
and
not an easy.
Not an easy life, not at all. Beautiful and meaningful, and definitely fun to write about. Possibly more fun to write about than it is to live.
Sure. Yeah.
And I love reading about agriculture. But the time I have spent actually helping out told me that I'm probably not cut out for full-time farming. It's hard and lonely.
And uncertain, you know, year to
and
year.
Uncertain.
You just don't know what's coming next. I asked you earlier what happened to Helen, and we agreed that, you know, she's not doing the nightly news. She's wowing us on some syndicated public radio show right now. What about Cora Lee? What happened to Cora Lee? When we leave Cora Lee, she is basically serving out her 2-month notice. And, you know, of course, Danny pays her that just wonderfully heartfelt compliment on the air at the end. And that's it. And I stopped and I put the book down and I said, what's going to happen to her? Because I think, like you just said for yourself, I'm not sure that she could just live on the farm. She doesn't seem to be wired that way. Where would, if you had to take her somewhere, where would she go next?
Ooh. She loves the medium. I think she would never want to leave. And she loves meeting people. She loves, you know, if she didn't love the extension into other people's lives, she wouldn't be so harmed by the other people's suffering. I don't know, maybe she'll go and work for Ira Glass. She'll be Ira Glass's kind of rural go-to reporter, and she'll do funky, sound-rich
There you go.
stories for This American Life.
Either that or she'll be a grief counselor, one or the other.
Right.
You never know. I saw this review myself, and an audience member writes in and says, I've seen your novel called, quote, a great public or the great public radio novel. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, I just want to pass out. I'm so happy.
I mean, it says a lot in one question. I mean, public radio is a world unto itself. I know that when we were preparing for this event tonight, I was talking to someone at the Maine Public who said, yeah, at least half the station is reading this book right now, because it's a world with which we're all familiar when it comes to the finished product, at least those of us who listen to public radio for our news and other programming. But unless someone like myself who operated in proximity to them, you don't really appreciate how they operate. You got a taste of that. What are your thoughts on public radio as an institution? And it's facing some difficult times right now. Tell me a media organization that isn't. But it must, I assume all these years later, it's still probably somewhat near and dear to you.
It's very near and dear to me. I'm always rooting for it. It's, I have great hope for it, I think, because I think it's unique. There is a sensibility, a wise sensibility to it, as well as a really satisfying aesthetic. And there is something about radio, ever since Marconi, we have loved this machine that tells us stories. So I am always worried, but when it comes to public radio, I'm also hopeful.
No, that's good. As long as you don't have to do the fund drives, right?
Oof.
The fund drive sequences I always love, because they're, I mean, you can take that script and plunk it down into any market. I'm going to get in trouble for this, but it's something they got to do. I totally get it, but it's not easy. It's not an easy way to subsist. Another audience member writes, "Thank you, love the novel," and wants to know, is this the first of many long form efforts, which is another way of saying, what's next?
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. I am tinkering with something. I don't know if it has legs yet. I think it's different, but maybe it isn't. I'm experimenting with a very non-neurotic protagonist this time, which is a lot of fun.
Oh, okay. So there's something in the works.
Something in the works, but no promises. I learned so much from writing this. I had taken a couple of writing classes and read a lot of books about writing and listened to a million podcasts, but there is something about trying it out yourself. I learned something about motifs and recurring symbols. As an English major, I wrote about those. I'm starting to think that those just exist because a writer can only come up with so many ideas. And so a bee smoker or birds, they're going to come up over and over again. I think it might be, and classical illusions. I wonder if it could be a dirty little secret that when the gang is on Beckles Island, I needed some things to happen before Jeremy is found. And I could not figure out what could occur in this period. And then I thought, well, what is a classic story? What happens on an island? Circe, okay, a witch. She puts a spell on people. And that's how I had Mrs. Hale get Father Burris stoned on pot cookies. And she has those weird dogs in the yard. That was me reaching back into classical antiquity for just some help. And I'm wondering if that's why it always happens. Let me know if in the course of these interviews, ask other writers if they do that too.
I will. That's good to know. When in doubt, reach for the pot cookies, right?
Maybe that's why classical antiquity still exists in modern literature.
Yeah. That was hilarious. I mean, and what I loved about that is that he is such a gentle guy, and he was ticked off. I mean, he wasn't holding back at all with her about how he felt about what she had done to him, especially when she tries to blame it on him for eating from the wrong side of the cookie tray. He said that was a classic. And now with marijuana legal in Maine, the sky's the limit, right? So
right.
I don't know what's going to happen. Well, I'm afraid that, as always, here we are. We have pretty much run out of time, but this has just been great. I feel like we could talk all night about this story, and I hope that there will be many more like it that that come from your keyboard, because as I said at the outset, it was part reliving things we've all been through here in Maine, but doing it in such a way that brought your imagination, your great writing into it. And this book's going to stick with me for a long time. Every time I drive up through down East Maine now, I'm going to be thinking about Beckles Eye and all these characters who, they exist in my head anyway. So great work. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. And thank you to Maine Public. This has been the honor of my life. Thank you.
Well, keep it up.
Thanks.
And I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today, and give a second shout out to Bull Moose and Coffee by Design for sponsoring tonight's event. Our next book club meeting is next month, when we will be taking on if you can see it, A Moon in Full by Marfine Chan. Great piece of work. Once again, Gillian, thanks for joining us. Thank all of you for coming. Have a great rest of your night, and we will see you in June.